All right. So who would like to question or comment anything that that Shanti has brought up in her presentation? Lydia.
You're on mute, Lydia.
Yeah, please unmute yourself, Lydia.
But it was out of humility. Sorry. So Shanti, it was wonderful, this talk. The way the way you showed the two extremes of these very elusive things of self-worth. We don't have the right words, you know, befriending ourselves, self-worth, pride. Pride in itself is a word that has been a little bit molested by the Christian tradition, and to put it in its right place is really, really important. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a book about that. I don't remember the word. I remember that I found that book a few years ago, and it really was life-changing. I defended virtue epistemology. This is why I like it so much, as the right way. I talked about epistemology this morning, as the right epistemology for philosophical practice.
Yes.
Because in a way it unites, you cannot have only almost intellectual virtues and not moral virtues. It unites both of them. And intellectual virtues, as you said, are the precondition of moral virtues.
Yes.
So I think this is the right epistemology instead of your statement is right or wrong, you know. A virtue epistemology is the right epistemology for the purposes of most philosophical practices. So I defended it in Rethinking Philosopher Responsibility. So I just wanted to say something. Because I reviewed the literature then, I saw that the renewal of interest in virtue epistemology uses the word virtues and vices because many of them came from a Christian tradition, like Linda Zagzebski, who revived that. And you don't find these words when you're dealing with Aristotle. So for example, as you said, it would be a mean. For Aristotle, it would be within two extremes. But you have chosen the word vices because you said it's more powerful. Just a thought. I also thought that they were thinking about virtues and vices and not a mean. And as you're going for the mean, why not revert to Aristotle's proposal to see that as extreme of the same feeling that goes a little bit too little or a little bit too much? Like there is a continuum, yes?
Yeah, it's gentler, isn't it? It's gentler, kinder, and easier to swallow, I would say.
If you want, you know, it's an option, and then you can slide with that. But I see that you get also redemption and liberation. You get much clearer results by this terminology. So maybe.
Well, and you know, my client used those terms, and that's why I used them. You know, they came from her, and she is a spiritual person, and she has been looking for redemption, you know, her whole life. So, you know, but there is that, isn't there? There is a redemption in the living a virtuous life. It is redeeming.
Great question and answer, Lydia. I would endorse that from my own experience too. And I can't tell you how many times over the years, Shanti, that the Nicomachean ethics has been the problem solver for clients with this kind of issue. Of course, they never knew about it, as you already pointed out, and I think you very rightly made the distinction between self-esteem and moral self-worth, a distinction that needs to be far more broadly made in the U.S. Again, I'm sure you will acknowledge as a psychologist that Americans are taught really from an early age to think in terms of self-esteem. And this is reinforced in the education system. Our students are supposed to feel good about themselves, but have no conception of what moral self-worth means, right? No conception. If you ask them, what is moral self-worth? You'll draw blanks. But they all can tell you how they're feeling about themselves on a given day, but not how to sustain good feelings necessarily. Right? So I think it's very poignant and probably more so today than than it ever has been. So Sarah, are you waving your hand because you want to speak? Please unmute yourself. And then we have
Well,
Gary.
I think perhaps the goal I see is in that case is perhaps I wouldn't think of it as curing this woman Nancy of her pride, but getting her to a place of self-acceptance. I mean, I don't see myself necessarily as taking her word for it when she says she's proud. I see myself perhaps saying, it's being self-critical shows humility, and you are being self-critical. That's what I had to say.
Were you saying, Sarah, like at the end, or, are you saying like along the way while she was?
Yeah, I think I might have said along the way, if she said, gee, I'm proud, I might have said, it seems to me you really are self-critical and the way you're criticizing the way you've been behaving, and being self-critical shows humility.
Yes. I think, when she finally got to the point of recognizing her hubris, right, which she did herself, then I think you're right, that there was a humility there, and that was part of the redemption as well, right? Finally accepting her limitations, her faults, which she had never been able to do before. She'd always sort of seen herself as perfect. So yeah, that
there's also self-forgiveness. I mean, I think that's very important.
Yes, she has forgiven herself, definitely, because I think the moral bad luck helps too, because when you realize that you started out kind of at a disadvantage, and it wasn't your fault. You still have to do something about it, but it was the circumstances you were born into that really created how you behaved until you became aware of it. And so I think that idea of the moral bad luck also lends itself to forgiveness of oneself.
That's a very interesting comment, and you're going to prompt a response to Nagel from all of this, because this moral bad luck question is a very interesting one, and I think it could also be taken to an extreme,
yes,
as well. And it could become a vicious argument as well as a virtuous one. I know you agree, but no one that I know of has actually made that kind of response from our field. But it's very interesting application. So Andrew, please, then Gary, and then Rick.
Yes, I think what you're doing is very important, Shanti. I think it's not just virtue epistemology, but the use of virtue, the reflection on virtue, the development of virtue in general in philosophical counseling seems to me to be worthwhile and important. Because the folks you're talking about, they don't just have lack of virtues in how they go about knowing, but they have these general, what you call vices, that are influencing how they see themselves. So, they have, it's virtue in a larger sense than just epistemic that we need to deal with, I think, in people. But one of the things that occurred to me was, the balance here is a kind of healthy sense of self-worth. Healthy pride, I guess, is what we're looking for, which is, in a way, saying you want to have someone a solid sense of ego. I mean, maybe that's a bad way to put it, but you don't. Well, the reason I mentioned that, I put it in those terms, is because I remember reading from something Lou wrote and said in our workshop that at least his aim in philosophical counseling is ego reduction or ego elimination. The ego is the problem, as I understood you, Lou, in a lot of people's troubles. But if you go too far, I would think, in reducing ego, in eliminating ego, you wind up with something like the first case that Shanti presented, the woman who has very low sense of self, complete self-negating kind of person. And that's, we think really not very good for her growth as a person. So I guess are we looking for balance here, or is this something that ties into what Alex was saying? First stage is you need to help develop a positive ego sense. And then in later stages of self-growth, you can go about trying to transcend ego, eliminate ego, and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering where does the development of strong ego fit in to this process of philosophical counseling? It seems to be necessary, but do you also then want to go beyond that? I don't know. I'm just raising that question.
Maybe one thing is too that is the terminology, Andrew. Maybe when one person is talking about ego, maybe they're talking about super ego, or maybe we're talking about self. Sometimes people use the term ego to mean a self, so I think that, I always think of it as like having a solid sense of yourself. That's proper pride and self-respect, that you have and you could be, that you could call that having a good solid ego, right? Then you could say on the one side it's egotistical, and then the other side you could say it's lack of self, like not knowing. So it's terminology, right?
May I just jump into
yes, please.
answer you, Andrew, because what I would want you to think about is the distinction between egolessness and Shanti's presentation involving low self-esteem and low self-worth, servility, and an unhealthy absence of pride. That woman does not have egolessness. That woman's ego is turned against itself. That woman actually has an ego, but has an unhealthy ego, in my view. And I'm not speaking as a psychologist, I'm not trained as one. So that would be my view. It's not that she doesn't have enough ego, it's that her ego is actually working against itself to be unhealthy. Whereas dissolution of the ego through Asian practices, we have nothing in the West that accomplishes this. I'm sorry. That's why we have so many problems in the West, partly. But dissolution of the ego is always a good thing in my experience. But to set this up back to Alex, the first half of one's life, if that's what it is, one really does need to grow in this way and develop an independence from parents and independent thinking, and to become the kind of autonomous reasoning being that we in the West tend to value in civil society. I agree with all that. But then in the latter half of one's life, I think you got to start getting rid of a lot of the unnecessary baggage that we accumulate in that process. And that's what I mean by dissolving those parts of the ego that become unhealthy and end up still working against oneself. Okay, we could have a whole conference on this, but it's a really interesting question, and we can all merit, I think, by thinking about it more. Okay, and you're nodding. So let's go on. We have a spew of hands. We're going to end up doing this more in happy hour, but let's carry on because there's a lot of people showing up here, including Gary and Rick and Patricia and Chalista. So let's just go in that order, okay? Gary, Rick, Patricia, Chalista, please.
Yeah, I really liked the talk. I thought it was, it really did, hit a lot of things right on the money. Couple of comments that might be helpful, and then a kind of philosophical question, because I really you know, that something that you might say kind of perplexes me about the area, some of the area that you're working in. So the philosophical or the observations, one, I wind up teaching Aristotle and Plato a lot, even though that's not my area of specialty. And one of the things I find, at least with the way students, you know, in Toronto receive the term virtue, right, is that it's very helpful to point out to them that arete is sometimes translated as excellence, and excellence of character. And so, you know, I mean, there's actually, I've used, I think it's Urmson, there is a translation of Aristotle's ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, where in fact the word excellence is used for arete instead of virtue. So, I mean, feeling a certain, I thought that might be useful to bring in because it might help you with a certain freedom, you know, about how you interpreted the concept. Now related to that, I think, you know, when we talk about self-esteem, one of the things that I think is really problematic about the discussion of self-esteem a lot of the time is that people are encouraged to have it by telling themselves to have it, rather than grounding it in accomplishment. And, you know, one way, if you get people to see that, you know, it's really like you have a kind of self-esteem that comes from genuine accomplishments, is that, you know, even a person who has, you might say, a very low level of ability in a very wide range of areas can have like wonderful moral accomplishments, right? They can actually have really wonderful ethical accomplishments. They can actually, you know, cultivate in themselves an ability to do things for other people. So even if you can't, you want to play the best piano, the best rendition of one of Beethoven's piano sonatas or something, you have those ambitions and your self-esteem comes up against that, you know, you know, certain limitations. The great thing about self-respect founded in ethics is that, you know, that's a lot harder to take away from you. It's actually like a really secure foundation. So, like, I think it's one of the things that gets really messed up when you don't bring this into, you know, psychotherapy, and it seems to me to actually be pushed out as though it was going to harm the client a lot of the time. And so you know, the question was, and it may be too big a question even to take on. It seems to me that there's a difference between the kind of hubristic person that you described very vividly and accurately, and the kind of person who might be out there, and I'm not even sure if they exist, who just thinks that they are the best thing. You know, I mean, so often it seems to be a compensation. You know, the hubris seems to be a compensation for, you know, things that in other ways would give rise to self-loathing. You know, I wonder if there's anyone out there who actually just plain loves themselves in some ludicrous kind of way, or if that's, you know, not ever been your experience.
Well, that's
Anyway.
Trump, right? I mean, that's Trump.
Right.
But, I mean, there's a lot of narcissists, and that's why psychologists find them to be mostly untreatable, you know,
Right.
because they can't open themselves up to other things. And that's why I was saying I was very fortunate that life, and I do find this as a counselor, that life, well, for all of us, right? Life presents us with life lessons if we're paying attention. And so when a person is in philosophical counseling and these things kind of happen, like the break-in, right? It might have been treated very differently by a psychologist.
Right.
But, you know, we treated it as a moral issue, and, you know, and that made all the difference. And so I have found that when people are working with me, life does present those opportunities. I don't know if she would have ever admitted to all of those things had that not occurred. And so, yeah, your point is well taken about it.
Well, yeah, could we move on, please?
Sure,
We are
sure.
running a little short. Rick?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you again, Shanti, for turning me on to virtue and vice epistemology.
Thanks for being humble enough to admit you didn't know much about it.
Yeah, I didn't know much about it. I had some generic ideas about it, but that was about it. I didn't realize how rich it was. But one of the books you recommended to me, I put in the chat for others because it was phenomenally rich with insight, and it made me realize, it's called Vices of the Mind by Qasim Qassam, just how applicable that can be to philosophical counseling. Just one of the things I would say about virtues or vices of the mind, right? Because that's the title of the book, is Vices of the Mind. One of the arguments that Qassam makes there about what virtue epistemology is, or vice epistemology, is about, well, what is the end, the telos of epistemology, or, you know, of our epistemic efforts? It's getting at the truth or cultivating knowledge. So virtues, intellectual virtues, are those character traits of mind which tend to get you there, and the vices tend to block you from getting there. So it's a really interesting idea. And the way that he analyzes the whole thing and breaks it down, it's just phenomenal. But now, seeing cases directly in philosophical counseling that you just walked us through really helped me see the value even more. Because that book was more at the abstract philosophical level. This was so, I mean, he uses examples, but yours were really in depth. So thank you. Excellent, excellent presentation.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Rick. Patricia, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, small comment and a little question to Shanti. I found your presentation excellent. I really enjoyed it, Shanti. So really, thanks a lot. Thank you. Absolutely. And a part of my comment is similar to Rick, so I make it quick, because I like a lot the terminology. Vices and virtue, it's really, I find them useful and handy. And maybe it's my Italian tradition or comes from Dante, but anyway, virtue is something that you don't have as given. You have to conquer a virtue, and you grow in that, and it's a life process. So I like it a lot. And vice is something that, of course, it brings us backwards and something dangerous and unhealthy, but still, like Dante, when he goes into hell with Virgilio, he has a sort of human eye, a human side, a sort of pietas. He loves people with vicious, because all of us sometimes have vices. So we are all made of some vices and some virtues. So we can be sympathetic with people with vices, and that's the thing that we do in our practice of philosophy. And then a question is it common for you, is a very practical question, is it common for you that your client lasts so long? I mean, 12 years, 13 years is a long, it's like more an analysis more than a practice, because my client is a sort of short kind of, I mean, let's say 1 year generally, or also 3-4 sessions, and then we say bye-bye to each other. I've been helpful, they're satisfied, and we say bye-bye. But I find it very interesting, this long period of consultancy. It means that it's a sort of need of confrontation, more than a need of a problem that have to be solved or queries. I don't know if I've been clear, but anyway, that's
very clear. Shanti, can you give a brief answer, please?
Well, this goes back to Peter Kestenbaum's work in clinical philosophy.
Yeah, the one you yeah.
And he says it provides the deepest healing of any, and this is what I found with, especially my hubris case. She went to Jungian analysis for 15 years and she never healed this split, and through philosophical counseling, proper pride and self-respect, she did. It took time. And I think, these confrontations with ourselves take time. And I plan to see my philosophical counselor till I die, because I'm going to be learning till I die. And there's nobody else that knows me better than him and can help me continue in the depth, to which I'm committed to. And so I feel the same with my clients, that why should they go to somebody else for their next problem? Just, we'll stick together, meaningful connections, right? That's Alistair McIntyre. I know they're meaningful connections and in every area of their life. So, I think with my client who's 78, I'm going to see her till she dies. We agree. Her dreams are very fruitful, and she's a writer. So that So I'm committed to long-term philosophical counseling when it's applicable. And
we don't have in our association any formal guideline or rule about this. We each have our own.
Thank you.
Style. There's no two philosophers agree about anything really. And so no two philosophers need to agree about how many sessions are appropriate for a client. That depends on your style of working with them, and it depends on the client. I try to get rid of my clients. My whole goal is to get rid of them. 1 session, great, perfect. 2 or 3 sessions, okay. 6 months is getting to be a long time. Why aren't we making progress? But this all depends on style, and there's no right or wrong way, to do this. As long as it's mutually beneficial, not coercive, and truly helpful, then there's no limitation. If we're all lifelong learners and lifelong teachers, there need be no rules to bind the duration of a counseling relationship. Charlista, you've been very patient. Please, Carol, go ahead. You have the last word.
You're muted, Carol.
Okay.
Unmute.
You're still muted.
You're muted.
Still muted.
There you go.
Okay. Hi, Shanti. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry that some of my airtime was consumed by being unmuted, by being muted. I mean, in any case, I have, of course, your presentation was quite rich, and like Patricia, I was sort of surprised and impressed that you had these relationships for so long, because we think of that more in analysis or really deep therapy. But I guess it depends on the type of problem that a patient or client presents to you. And healing the ego and seeing that a person's ego needs to be repaired is huge. I mean, that's a vast undertaking. And I think your use of Aristotle is very interesting. And, virtue and vice epistemology. That said, I think there's one problem, well, more than, let me put it in, not in terms of, problem in the sense of problematic question. If we look at Aristotle's idea about virtue, one of his most important of the virtues is greatness of soul, what he calls magnanimity, okay? And he gives a description of, well, he calls him the great-souled man, but it could be a woman too, one hopes. So he has certain criteria, and you look at them, and then you get to someone like, say, St. Augustine, whose idea of the great soul and is contradictory to that of Aristotle's. And then, you think about someone like Freud, everyone agrees that a certain degree of self-love or narcissism, in the good sense, is important for human flourishing and for becoming an ethical being. But so much of this and so much of one's conception of that seems to be culturally embedded and defined by grown within a certain ecology. Does that make sense to you? So if you look at the Greek conception of the ego, for Aristotle, some people might say, well, what's so great about the great-souled man? He thinks he's entitled to things, and that's exactly right. It's having the proper, the idea of what you're properly entitled to. Then you get to the Christian tradition, and you find this idea of self-abnegation important to having a great soul. You look at the itinerary of the soul, and it's really moving away from original sin. I'm speaking very broadly. I'm not a theologian, and nor am I of that faith, so I shouldn't. But basing it on the philosophers I've read, and then you read Freud, and you have a totally different picture. I think much more in line with Aristotle's, and so isn't it important first to decide? You're talking about healing her soul, and bringing the two, healing the split. But, you know, where, I guess it, you know, where the split occurs might be difficult to pinpoint. So that's what I think is culturally embedded. You know, if you take the Aristotelian idea and then say St. Augustine, we find ourselves with very different conceptions of that. So is that something that you can address or speak to?
Well, I think one of the things that would be helpful is the woman that I've been learning from, Alessandra Tonassini. She's written a book called Measures of the Self, which is coming out this year. And she takes it all and puts it all together in like attitudes, you know, not just like a term, but she broadens these definitions to include, you know, a depth and a breadth that I wasn't able to do today. So I think her book isn't out yet, but I think it's supposed to come out at the end of this year. You'll see it. It's already on Amazon. You can pre-order it. Alessandra Tonassini, and her book is called Measures of the Self.
Shanti, if you can type it into the chat room,
Okay,
please.
I'll be glad to do that.
Everybody can see it, read it, order it.
I'll do that.
Okay, please do. Carol, this is why our code of ethics, and back to APPA, you know, our code of ethics really does say in a few different places that philosophical counselors need to be aware and educable and sensitive to the worldviews of our clients, which can differ very greatly depending on what you're calling cultural embeddedness or cultural ecology, to what one could call an operating system. Everybody's walking around with an operating system, right? And we have to, as philosophers, be, I think, magnanimous enough in our outlooks to understand that a client cannot be helped until we get a handle on their operating system.
Absolutely.
And that's part of the purpose of the inquiry. That's why we're not diagnosing, we're conducting an inquiry. So may I just wrap this up with one real important point about Aristotle that I would ask us all not to lose sight of, and that is his distinction between intellectual and moral virtues. Yeah, they're both important, but my favorite example is from daily life, not from the Nicomachean Ethics. If you think about the school bus drivers who pick kids up every day of the week and take busloads of kids to their schools in the suburbs and exurbs, right? And then bring them home at the end of the day. And they're not necessarily well-educated people. I don't know any school bus drivers with PhDs. But you know what? They have tremendous moral virtue. They have to, because they are dutiful people concerned with the safety and well-being of these children to whom they're being entrusted by their parents to be picked up and taken to school and brought home safely every day. These are very moral people. Okay.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
Whereas the people that they end up being taught by in the classroom could be extremely well-educated people who are imparting venomous ideologies to them, morally poisonous ideologies coming out of corrupted intellectual virtue. So I think that the moral virtues on balance are really the important ones for us all, and in civil society, the intellectual virtues are important, but as Aristotle said, if intelligence is used to bad ends, it can be very destructive.
I totally agree. I'm, you know, and I think what you know, that's a very important distinction. And I also like the idea that, you know, a sense of one's moral worth should really be the foundation of everything. I'd also want to make a distinction just off the cuff of it between being being highly schooled and being educated, because I think that the person who's moral, who has a profound moral sense, is also a person who has a type of education, you know, from experience. It's important. But I was just curious as to, you know, what constitutes a healthy self, you know, and a healthy self-worth. And I think it's a hard question. I do think it's a hard question because, you know, sometimes to go back to what Lydia was talking about, self-deception can come in. And if you see what I mean, I don't know if I'm being clear. So I found it fascinating, to think of it that way, to help a person become, a quote, great soul, to attain that. But they also have to, and explore their own, their values. But, not to take this to too fine a point, but, say, during World War II, you could say in France, you had the collaborators and you had the resistance, of people. And each probably could justify their behavior. Or try to. And I obviously would not, many people that I know probably wouldn't be here if I thought that the collaborators had some kind of virtue. But we're in the middle of this kind of culture war, as you know, and the problem is that I guess that we need to have enough, that a certain degree of self-confidence comes in too. You have to be, not only have a sense of being moral, but have a conviction. And I think that that's very, I think, Lou, that's what I'm talking about. And then,
Fair enough.
I'm sure the school bus driver could say, well, these children's lives are important, their safety is important, and even their beliefs are important. And many people who are not part of the educational system are profoundly concerned with what children are taught.
Well, and some in the system are just as profoundly concerned, including yours truly. But listen, I want to thank Shanti.
It's great talk, Shanti. Thank you.
I want to thank Shanti very much for all of this and for being so interesting, engaging, and thought-provoking as always. And I want to thank all of you for this day. This is a wonderful day that we've had together. A great conference, even if we're not all in social contact. We've done credit to the association, credit to Philosophical Practice, and we've made Zoom look pretty good too. So thank you all very much indeed. I'm inviting you to stick around. I'm planning to take 5 minutes and I'm going to have a glass of wine. Damn it, it's Saturday evening, and I'm opening a bottle of wine. I'm not going to drink it all in front of you, but I'm going to have a glass and raise a toast. And if anybody wants to come back in 5 minutes and join me to raise a toast, then we can have a little symposium and we can carry on. I'm not going to speak. I just would be happy to facilitate a continued dialogue on any topic whatsoever. But I'm going to wrap this conference up officially, and thank you all once again for your tremendous engagement and participation and all the wonderful work you're doing for philosophy and philosophical practice. Thank you so much for being part of APPA. We all benefit from your engagement. Okay.
Thank you.